She started finding notes on her walk home. After telling my mother about some stories from the subreddit, she revealed to me the following story from her childhood, which I found truly shocking and disturbing. When my mom was in 5th grade, she went to a grade school only a few blocks away from her house. Therefore, it was not uncommon for her to walk to and from school with her childhood friend and neighbor, Pam. Now, as young and naive children, they were in their own little worlds and didn't really understand the disturbing events that were about to take place. One day, on their walk back home from school, they were walking past a park they walked by every single day and stumbled across a note. In this note were explicit and disturbing sexual scenes that my mother did not tell me details of. She did, however, have a look of complete and utter shock when she recalled them. She told me that back then, Pam and her thought nothing of it, and only laughed at the ridiculousness of it as little girls do when approached with the icky topic of sex. They kept the note and walked on, forgetting about it quickly. But soon enough, they found another note on their usual path home, another note describing sexual details that little girls should never be exposed to. At this point, my mother told my grandmother about it. Times were different back then, and my grandma, although bothered by her daughter being exposed to such inappropriate notes, was not too worried by it. The notes kept popping up. My mom and Pam simply thought that maybe they were accidentally uncovering notes that someone was leaving for their lover, who happened to be into the same demented sex acts as they were. Yet, these two young girls really didn't want to find these notes any longer, and decided to walk a different way home every day instead. This is where it gets freaky. They started taking a route that followed completely different streets and did not at all go near the park that they once found the notes in. Yet, they began finding these notes once again on their new way home. My mom told me that the note she remembered most was a description of what his semen tastes like. They found this note tucked away in a little red box beside a tree. The last note they found, after dozens of them, before they told their parents and teachers, said something like the following: "There's a man in a van who would like to pick up the redhead and her friend. My mother is, at this point, a 12-year-old redhead." The contents of this last note, an expression of this man's desire to abduct my red-headed mother and her friend, showed undoubtedly that the notes that they have been finding for the past 2 years of walking home from school have been meant for them. All the deviant sexual acts and the odd description of semen flavor and fetishes were all meant for these prepubescent girls. Perhaps the most disturbing part of this is the fact that he knew the ways and times they walked home. He knew them well enough to strategically put these notes where only they could find them, and he knew to switch the locations when they began taking other pathways home. Ultimately, my mother never noticed a man in a van watching her and her friend walk home because, like I said, they were silly little girls lost in their own little world. But my mom knows now that he was there watching, writing these sick fantasies for her to read. The school was informed of what was happening, and although no police action or anything like that was ever taken, the boys of her class volunteered to walk them home and make sure they got home safe. The notes never showed up again. Walking home from school, he started to follow me. In middle school, I used to walk home from school with 2 other friends nearly every day. Our walk would take us along one of the more congested roads through most of our 2-mile walk, but towards the end, as we got near our neighborhood, we would cut through an industrial area that led to a small trek of woods near a canal and a dirt road that led up towards the back entrance area of our neighborhood. One day, I had to make this walk on my own, which was no big deal. As I got towards the area where you would leave the main street walkway and cut through the industrial area, I noticed a guy just hanging out around the cutoff area. I never seen him before, and since my hood was really small, I knew he wasn't from anywhere I lived. I sort of adjusted my direction that would lead me a little further away from him, but still, in the general direction of my normal shortcut. As I adjusted my walking direction, I noticed that the guy had begun to follow along behind me, maybe 100 feet or so. Just before going down the dirt road, there was one building where we'd usually duck inside to get water from their fountains. I went quickly inside so I could get a drink, but also try and figure out where the hell this guy was going. As I left the building and walked around to the back of it, where the dirt road started, I noticed he was about halfway down the road just standing there. He was acting like he was looking out over the canal area and just standing there. If I was going to get home, I was going to have to walk down the dirt road and past him. So, I slowly made my way down this slight embankment and had all kinds of wild thoughts running throughout my head. Can I outrun him? Should I grab a rock? What should I do if he attempts to grab me? I made it maybe 20 steps towards him when I heard a car horn honking back behind me. I spun around and there was my dad waving at me. I turned around and jogged up to his car. My dad didn't live with me. My parents were divorced, and he lived about 10 miles away. He just so happened to be driving down the main road that day and saw me walking home from school. When he turned his car around to come give me a ride home, he lost track of where I went, so on a whim, he drove down this dirt road to see me as I was starting to walk towards this guy. As I got in my dad's car, that strange guy looked up towards where we were and started walking back in our direction. He didn't continue down that path towards my neighborhood, and I never saw him again. I often think about telling my dad about this story, and how I think he saved my life that day. Well, maybe. Who knows? The walk home from school. I was in 4th grade when this happened. I lived in a decent-sized town, and my school didn't have buses that took us directly to our street or our house. The buses would drop us off at the local high school, and from there, we would have to walk back home. Usually, I would walk home with neighbors and friends, but this was one of those times that everybody was sick. I was unfortunately left to walk alone, so I started on my normal route home through the busy neighborhoods, but something seemed a little off. Nobody was out and about like usual. However, I didn't think much of it. As I was about halfway home, this red truck is approaching from behind me, so I move over to make sure I'm not in the way, but the truck pulls up on the sidewalk, and 2 men jump out and start running after me. I take off running as I'm crying and screaming. I ran to a house that I knew my teacher lived at and started banging on the door. And after what seemed like hours, but was only 5 minutes, the door opens and she sees me crying, so she pulls me inside. At this point, the 2 men have disappeared. My teacher called my sister to let her know what had happened and that she would be bringing me home shortly after we had talked to the police. The men were never found, but 2 other girls had made reports of the same truck and the same descriptions of guys trying to abduct them. Followed home from school. Having just finally made an account on Reddit yesterday, and posting about what happened the other day got me thinking of some other creepy stories that have happened to me in my time. This happened a few years ago. I was probably in the 8th grade, so 13 or 14 years old. I walk home from school because I live on a dead-end road just across the street from the school, with no more than 6 or 7 houses on it. Weeks prior to this occurrence, I had started to notice a small red car showing up in the parking lot of the shut-down bowling alley and bar, whose back parking lot faces my street before it turns. It seemed to always be there when I walked home from school, or when I walked my dog. A few weeks later, I was walking home from school, and instead of the car being in the parking lot, it was parked on the side of my road, on the very end just before the highway. A little note, I live in a small town with no more than 5,000 people in it, so when I say highway, I don't mean a big highway. At this point, I'm probably around 5 to 100 pounds. Female. To get to my street, you have to cross from the school parking lot, which is directly across from it, so I didn't think anything of it, due to the fact that school just let out, and he was in one of the most populated areas of the town at this time of day. He was parked on the left side of the road from my perspective, so I decided to cross the other side of the road to walk around this man's car, hoping not to bother him. He had his window rolled down, and he was wearing a bro tank, which is entirely strange, because it was the dead middle of winter and probably around -30 degrees Fahrenheit. The man had to have been freezing. I was a little concerned at first because I didn't see movement. It was almost as if he was trying not to be seen. When I caught eye contact with him, he leaned forward in his seat and started to ask me something. He looked like a normal guy, maybe late 20s, early 30s. It was just his smile that set me off. It altogether was just very wide and looked sinister, if you ask me. He asked me for directions to a park nearby, which I thought was strange, because it was winter time, and there was snow on the ground. But I politely gave him directions, and he went on his way, or so I thought. At this moment, as I turned the corner of my street, I noticed the car turn back onto my street. I tried to ignore it since my house was one of the first on the street. That's when he started creeping behind me. I started sprinting down the street and into my yard, and the car followed. When I got home, my dog was on the porch waiting to get let in from going to the bathroom. In my other story, I mentioned that my dog was 1.5 years old, but that would be currently, so at this point, he was still a puppy, but still about 50 pounds. I sat on the porch for a minute with him, despite being freezing from the temperature, when the man pulled into my driveway, smiling at me. At that point, my mom came outside to let the dog in when she saw me sitting on the porch, and yelled at me for not getting out of the cold. Before I could explain to her what happened, the man pulled out of the driveway and drove away. Fast forward about a year or so later, I was a freshman in high school, so I still couldn't drive, and mind you, I haven't seen this car since that day. But I was with a friend and her mom, and we were at the bank when I saw the car. I'm not sure if he saw me or not, but it was probably spring at this point, so maybe about 50 degrees Fahrenheit, so it was fairly warm compared to the brutal winters we have. That being said, my friend had her window rolled down, so there was a clear shot for him to see me. As we pull out, the car pulls out behind us and starts taking every turn we take. We start driving faster and taking random turns on back roads because that's basically what our town is mainly known for. Mainly just back roads with 3 highways that pass through downtown. The car takes every turn we do but keeps its distance. Eventually we lost it and went to my friend's house, where I stayed that night. A few months later, I still live in the same house by that closed down bowling alley, and even now, every once in a while, I still see that car, just sitting there, waiting. This has been going on for years. And I'm still not sure what could happen. The police have been called several times by other people on our street, but to no avail. They can't do much because he hasn't technically done anything illegal except loiter. He's still around, and I've come to be used to it, but with caution. So, creepy man who followed me home from school, let's not meet again.